It's showtime, everybody. It's Michael Shermer here for The Michael Shermer Show. My guest today is Cathy Young. Cathy is a writer at The Bulwark. She's also a cultural studies fellow at the Cato Institute, a columnist for Newsday, and a contributing editor to Reason. Previously, she was an associate editor at Arc Digital and a columnist for the Boston Globe, the Detroit News, and Real Clear Politics. Her work has appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, The Week, Foreign Policy, The Atlantic, Quillette, The New Republic, and elsewhere. Young was born in Moscow and came to the United States with her family in 1980 and is the author of two books, Cease Fire, Why Women and Men Must Join Forces to Achieve True Equality, and Growing Up in Moscow, Memories of a Soviet Girlhood. She has a BA in English from Rutgers University, and you can follow her on Twitter at CathyYoung63. In this conversation, we discuss, obviously, the Russian elephant in the room, Russian culture, Russian history, Putin, what's going on with Ukraine, and what the past can tell us about the future of where we should go from there. But Cathy's also a regular commentator on American culture, society, politics, and so forth. So I ask her a lot of questions about hot button issues, race, critical race theory, the BLM movement, the Me Too movement, gender, sex, trans, and all of that. And she's a very insightful, thoughtful person. I like her because I don't get the sense from her that she's committed to either political side, left or right, conservative or liberal. I'm not sure she would even describe herself as a libertarian directly, but just somebody who's more of a single issues person like me. And I like that. That is to say, I can't tell you what her position is going to be on a lot of different issues ahead of time, and that's good. That is to say, we should evaluate people's opinions on different issues one at a time, as opposed to the way it normally goes, which is I can tell you what somebody believes on almost anything if I know their position on one particular issue. So if you enjoy this podcast, please pass it along to your friends and colleagues and go to skeptic.com/donate and give us a little support there. All right, thanks for listening. Here's our episode. And we're live. Cathy Young, how you doing?
I'm good, thank you.
These
it's
crazy
good
times.
to finally be here.
Yes,
indeed.
I'm a longtime fan of your work. I don't think we've met in person, but you know what I like about
I think we did once. We met, I think, in 2015, was it, at a Quillette party?
Oh, right. Yes, in Toronto.
Right.
Yes,
Yeah.
that's right.
Or 16,
okay.
actually. January 16.
Right.
Yeah. But very briefly. So, yeah, it's very good to talk to you. I'm a fan as well.
What I like most about your work is I can't predict what your position is going to be. And that's very unusual in the media. Most shows I can tell you if I know somebody's position on one issue, abortion or immigration or gun control, I can tell you pretty much what they think about everything else, which is not good because you should think each of these through independently, I think. And so I don't know how you classify yourself.
I like to keep people on their toes,
So I don't know how you describe yourself politically, but and of course we want to dive into the whole Russian thing. But since you're a longtime commentator and observer of the American scene, let's just hit some of the hot button issues right off the bat, and then we'll get into your background about Russia, because you just did that piece on the Don't Say Gay bill, and I've only kind of just barely scratched the surface of that whole thing. When you see the liberal side, you can't say gay, that sounds terrible. But then I read the sentence like they're teaching 5-year-olds about gender and sex, and I have a 5-year-old. I'm thinking, that doesn't sound right. So what's the story of the Don't Say Gay bill?
Oh, well, how much time have you got? No, I think that this is a classic thing where there are actually some good points on both sides, but it's almost become a dirty word to say both sides, because we have this word, both sidism. And of course, it's true that in some cases there aren't really two valid sides to the story. But this is not one of them. I think, first of all, Don't Say Gay is definitely a misnomer. It was a derogatory nickname that was picked very deliberately to suggest that this bill actually makes it illegal to say gay. And we've seen this ridiculous thing where people are paying for huge billboards in Florida that say gay. Well, if you want to waste your money, be my guest. But there's nothing in this bill that would actually prevent people from saying the word gay, either in schools or anywhere else. I do think that the bill has issues where it's very broadly written. What it says on the face of it mainly is that in public schools in Florida, you cannot teach about sex and gender identity in grades K through 3, or later than that in a manner that is not age appropriate as determined by state standards. Now, the problem is that, first of all, obviously age appropriate is very much in the eye of the beholder, and I think the state standards are also kind of subjective. There's also some confusion about what teaching about sex and gender identity, or instruct, I think is the word that the bill uses, actually means. People have raised the issue, and some of it I do think is in bad faith, but I think there are legitimate concerns. If, for instance, a teacher on the staff is gay and is married to a partner of the same sex, and somehow their marriage comes up, or let's say even if a kid during a classroom presentation where kids talk about what they did over the weekend, and let's say there's a kid that has two moms or two dads who mentions going on a picnic with my moms, and then let's say somebody in the class says, well, why does Jenny have two moms when most people have a mom and a dad? Would it be okay for the teacher to say some families have two parents of the same sex? So there's a lot of confusion about what it actually means. What's also, I think, and I kind of hate the word problematic because it's been so overused by the social justice left, but, what is a problem, let's say, about this bill is that it basically empowers any discontented parent to sue the school if he or she believes that there's something going on in the instruction that violates this law. And you could really have a situation where schools get tied up in litigation, even if eventually it's found that there was nothing, nothing inappropriate going on. But there's, this could definitely create lots and lots of problems. So, yeah, I think this is a badly written, vaguely written bill that could result in a lot of hassles and a lot of headaches for teachers who are not doing anything wrong. On the other hand, I do think that a lot of the people who are up in arms about this bill are kind of in denial about the fact that there really is a lot of very questionable teaching going on in many schools. I don't know what the situation is in Florida. It's a pretty conservative state, but we've had a lot of real life stories of essentially teachers telling kids as young as 6, well, I'm actually non-binary, which means that I'm neither a man nor a woman, and you can decide whether you want to be a boy or a girl or something else. I think a lot of parents very legitimately will say that they really don't want their 6-year-old pondering the issue of their gender identity. And I don't want to get into the whole question of gender ideology and whether or not the concept of non-binary identity is something real or just this social justice fad. But I think these concepts are so complicated and kind of messy and often incoherent that I think most adults will not be able to think it through. And I think, people have expressed, for instance, concern, and this has even come up recently in New Jersey, where there's a bill being debated, where actually not a bill, but new state guidelines for teaching about sexuality and gender, and our Democratic governor is reviewing those right now and saying that there are legitimate parental concerns. And one of the concerns that parents have expressed, contrary to the idea that this is all coming from, reactionary, Bible-thumping people, one concern people have expressed is that a lot of the fashionable teaching about gender identity really seems to replicate some very, very conservative gender stereotypes. Like, if you're a boy who likes glitter and ballet, maybe you're not really a boy but something else. And if you're a girl who likes to wear pants and who likes short haircuts and who likes sports, maybe you should think about whether you're actually a girl or something other than a girl. So I think there's a lot of very, very legitimate questions, especially since kids often fall for ideas that seem new and interesting to them, and there's nothing new about teenage fads. The problem is that in a lot of cases, when it comes to explorations of gender identity, these explorations lead down the road of things like chest binding, which for girls, which a lot of experts have said is actually harmful to young women's health. In many cases, it leads to puberty blockers. In many cases, it leads to kids suddenly deciding that they want to take hormones so that their body is more consistent with the image that they have of themselves. And these are really, I really think it's kind of crazy for 14 and 15-year-olds in some cases to make these decisions. And it's interesting because a lot of progressives who get involved in these arguments and will argue very heatedly, will say things like, well, of course no minor is getting, no underage girls are getting chest surgery. And then you can actually look at studies which show that in one population that they surveyed of something like 150 transgender teens, or teens who identify as transgender, something like 20% of the biological females had actually had a mastectomy before the age of 18. And I think of those, like 13% of the total had chest surgery prior to the age of 15, or at least at 15 or younger. And I think there are very legitimate reasons to be concerned about what is happening in the schools that sometimes encourages kids to get on this path. And I think it's absolutely not this bigoted backlash against LGBT rights. So I think the subject is enormously complicated, and I think a lot of people don't realize, for instance, that there are very real tensions right now between the gay community, the kind of more traditional quote-unquote gay community. I mean, we've gotten to the point where just regular gays are traditional, and the transgender or the sort of gender identity community, where you have this notion, for instance, that it's actually bigoted to, if you're a gay male, to not be sexually attracted to a transgender man who has female genitalia. So we have this very, very tangled discourse, and I think the sort of simplistic answer that pits reactionary Republican bigots against enlightened progressive people who are defending civil rights is really way, way too simplistic, because there are vastly complicated issues here. And I actually do plan to be writing more about this.
Yeah, our latest issue of Skeptic is on trans matters. We had Lisa Davis do a deep dive, long feature piece on this about what we know scientifically. I mean, almost everybody is.
I'd like to see that.
I'll send it to you. Most people are cisgender. Most people are straight. So we're really talking about some percentages of people. So let's say gays, maybe it's between 3 and 10%. There's a lot of different data on that. And then trans, it's well less than 1%, maybe 0.5%. Although again, the studies are so new and there's so few studies on these. And then there's this gender dysphoria, where it happens at a young age, where somebody says, I always felt that way since a young age. And then you have the teenage phenomenon, which is much more recent. Like, it's kind of a trend in the classroom to be trans, not to be man or woman, but to be trans. Like, the example I use, I had a student a couple of years ago who announced during the middle of the semester she wanted to be a he. She changed her name. She started wearing men's clothes, cut her hair, and so forth. And she talked about it a lot. It was obviously important to her, but I got the impression, or I should say he, that he didn't want to be a man. This woman didn't want to be a man. She wanted to be trans because trans was kind of the trendy, cool thing, and you get a lot of reinforcement and love and attention and so forth. But again, that's not to say that there aren't some that aren't like that. Of course, there are, and it seems like what we're talking about here is a conflicting rights, right? So. Trans, male to female trans athletes who want to compete against women. Well, don't they have a right to do that? Well, yeah, but don't women have a right to compete against other women? So much of conflict in society seems to turn on these conflicting rights. And, my favorite quote from Thomas Sowell is, there are no solutions. There's just compromises. Life is filled with these compromises. You can't have everything.
And I will tell you, I have seen people on the right who take a very dogmatic position. Oh, there's no such thing as trans. It's really just mental illness, all of it. And it's completely impossible that a 5-year-old child would actually have gender dysphoria. This child must have been brainwashed by the mom or the dad who wants to have a trans child because it's trendy. And I think, we know so little about a lot of these issues that I think it's incredibly arrogant to just sit in judgment and say, oh, well, this just doesn't happen. I think there's a lot of evidence that it does, but a lot of these cases are much more complicated. I mean, if you want to spend a couple more minutes on this, I can talk about this book that I discuss in my most recent piece in the Bulwark, the one about the teaching of gender identity. So there's this book called Genderqueer by a person named Maya Kobabe, who identifies as non-binary and uses the pronouns air, but I'm just gonna not use pronouns at all because I'm not even sure how to pronounce some of this anyway. So Maya Kobabe is a biological female who wrote a memoir. It's a sort of comic book style memoir about growing up and coming into a non-binary identity. And I will say Maya Kobabe is a very talented person. I think this is a kind of, in some ways, very compellingly written and well-drawn book, which has been the subject of a huge amount of controversy in the schools, mainly because there are a few panels that are very sexualized. And I don't know if this book is actually part of a school curriculum anywhere, but it does appear in a lot of school libraries, apparently, and there have been huge blow-ups. Again, there are a couple of panels that I would kind of say border on pornographic, but I'm not even going to get into the details of that. You'll just, have to take my word for it. But the thing is that when I decided to actually check out this book, which is available on Kindle, and actually, if you're an Amazon Prime member, I think it's actually available for free on Kindle right now, so you can go and check it out. If you're curious. And I decided to see, what is this fuss all about? And I actually felt by the time I was done with this book that the sexually graphic panels were kind of the least of its problems, because the thing that really disturbed me is that the author talks, again, very compellingly about growing up sort of socially isolated. The parents were these sort of hippies who didn't quite fit into society. And, Maya hadn't even really socialized with too many other kids by the time of starting first grade. Didn't know a lot of the social rules as a very, very socially awkward child. Doesn't know, for instance, that there's a social expectation that girls on the beach will wear a top even if they don't have breasts yet, and is kind of, confused and shocked when the class goes out to the beach together and the teacher tells Maya to wear a top. As time goes on and Maya starts going through puberty, puberty causes Maya a lot of distress. And again, I get the impression that Maya didn't really know a whole lot about, what happens at puberty. The first period is a sort of intense anguish, and Maya describes again, sort of very compellingly, wearing a pad for such a long time that it became all kind of crusted and, disgusting. because going to the bathroom was such a source of anguish, and Maya just, has a horribly humiliating experience when the blood, seeps through and shows up on the pants. And, so basically menstruation in the female body just becomes a source of really intense distress. Same later when Maya starts getting breasts. And there is absolutely no indication anywhere that anyone tries to, deal with this through counseling, which would seem to be, an appropriate thing. And I think, it's really not that uncommon, I think, for children, and especially girls at puberty, to have these very confused and negative feelings about their changing body. And, a lot of the time it is a source of kind of shame, embarrassment, anguish, etc. I think I remember reading that something like 60% of adolescent girls at various times feel, shame and, distress about menstruation. So the thing that really, really troubled me is that in the book, all of this is basically taken as a sign that Maya is not really female, or is not really a woman or a girl. And that all of these, bad feelings are actually a sign of gender dysphoria. And Maya eventually concludes that, it's not really that I want to be a boy, it's that I really don't want to be anything. I'm neither a boy nor a girl, and I just really don't want anything to do with gender whatsoever. So eventually, to make a long story short, Maya adopts this non-binary identity, demands being referred to as air, constantly has these moments that actually do cause anguish, where people, including Maya's parents, forget to use these pronouns. And what's also interesting is that Maya actually says, being referred to as she didn't used to bother me, but now it does. And every time I hear the word she in reference to myself, it's almost like being punched in the stomach. And, supposedly at the end, this is sort of, this ends with Maya talking about feeling very happy when, an official letter arrives that uses the correct pronoun. But at the same time, it doesn't really even seem to alleviate the dysphoria, because Maya talks about still having horrible nightmares that have to do with periods, and, having nightmares about bleeding profusely and, in a public restroom where everyone can see. A gynecological examination is just a nightmare because, again, having a vagina is just the source of horrible, horrible dysphoria, which, again, the non-binary identity doesn't seem to alleviate at all. So my question is, why is this being presented as an inspirational journey? This is my question. Why are teenage girls who may be struggling with negative feelings about their bodies and about puberty, why are they being encouraged to read a book which, completely leaving aside the sexually graphic material, which I also kind of think is inappropriate for being in a public school? But, if I will say, if I had a teenage daughter, this is not a book that I would want her to read, because it's kind of like, if you're confused about your body, and if, you feel embarrassed about menstruating, and, you're terribly worried that blood may seep through and, people may see a blood stain on your pants, maybe you should think about what your gender really is, and so on. And I just really don't understand why this is considered progressive, because to me, it's almost like there's something really, really regressive about all this. Feminism was supposed to be about embracing female identity and saying, yeah, I can be a woman and I can still be an autonomous, strong, independent person. Now it's kind of like, well, if you feel really icky about your period, you should consider whether or not you're actually a woman. So I just think that we're heading down a very, very problematic path here.
Yeah, also confusing who you identify as and who you're attracted to. So Andrew Sullivan makes this point, and I asked Dave Rubin about it, who's also a gay married. And, Andrew's point was that, let's say he's growing up and at age, 12, 13, 14, he starts having sexual feelings for other boys. And so it turns out he's gay, and that's actually now okay. Not when he was growing up, but now it's, totally acceptable.
Right.
But what if he had had a nurse or a teacher or a schoolmate or somebody or a book that said, no, actually, the reason you're attracted to other boys is because you're secretly a girl inside. And it's like, oh, I hadn't thought of that. Right. Okay. And of course, Andrew's point is like, no, dude, you're just a gay guy and that's okay. Now it's okay. Right. Really embrace it. We fought for 50 years for these rights, right?
And what's interesting too, by the way, is if you look at the studies of, and Jesse Singal has done this a lot, and, he's gotten an amazing amount of abuse for this, by the way. Mm-hmm. He's looked into these studies of kids who desist from gender dysphoria, who go through a period of being very confused and kind of anguished about their gender. And then they just, most of them, apparently, if there are no interventions that steer them toward transitioning, most of them will eventually settle into, an identity that is consistent with their birth sex. And in many studies, it turns out that the majority of them turn out to be gay. It ranges usually, I think, from a little more than half to 2/3. So it's not maybe like overwhelmingly, oh, they're all gay, but at least a majority in most studies do turn out to be gay. And it's interesting that there are people who have said that gender transition is becoming a kind of conversion therapy for gay teens, and that's kind of one interesting way to look at it, because of course the kind of the progressive argument is that it's conversion therapy if you give any sort of counseling to a gender conflicted teen that encourages him or her to settle into the identity consistent with their birth sex. So again, I think I don't want to say that there is no such thing as transgender kids or transgender teens. I think there's a lot that we still don't really understand about the brain and gender identity, and sex differences obviously are a very thorny subject. And is there such a thing as a male brain and a female brain? Obviously, most studies will tell you that there's a great deal of overlap, although there are certain tendencies and certain differences. So I think, again, we don't really understand a lot of this, but I think it would really be good to remember that we don't understand a lot of this, and not to proceed as if it was just a simple question of, oh, here are these trans kids who we know are definitely trans and for whom the best solution is to transition and to live as the opposite sex. Well, not necessarily. And we do have more and more stories of detransitioners. So
another confusion is
humility. Humility is a good thing.
Yes. Another confusion is tying or bundling the scientific findings with moral principles, as if it doesn't come out a certain way, then people are going to lose their rights, or we can't argue for their rights. And now the valence is reversed. In the 90s, there was a push amongst the gay and lesbian community to argue that it's biological. I never chose to be gay. I've always felt this way. It's who we are. And there was all this push to find biological differences, like the gay part of the brain, that sort of thing. And I remember I hosted a gay speaker. He actually a researcher who studies neuroscience of homosexuality. And he presented this evidence that the hippocampus, I think it was the hippocampus, was slightly different in straight brains versus gay brains, right? And he put this slide up, and
I remember reading something.
I think it was Michael Bailey. Yeah. I think it was Michael Bailey. Anyway, he's like, you can clearly see here the difference.
I think so.
The difference in the neurons, and we're all looking like, are you sure there's a difference? I can't really see it, And then I think that one didn't replicate. But there was this push that for biological determination of who you're attracted to. Now it seems to be the opposite, right? The argument now is, the liberal position now is, you can be anything you want, which really makes older gays and lesbians nervous, because then they're afraid conservatives may push back and go, you see, you did choose a lifestyle and it was the wrong choice. You need to change your mind.
Right. Yeah, I think it's very, very complicated and confused right now, because I think especially the gender identity discourse, the part part of it is an argument that you were born this way. You were just you were born with a male body but a female brain, or vice versa. And then the other part, there's a different kind of trend where the argument is that it's gender fluidity is really the good thing, and that none of us are really definitively male or female, and really you can be whatever you want to be, and you can change your gender identities on a daily basis. I remember seeing a sticker, sort of, or a slogan on Tumblr, which is, by the way, Tumblr is the social media platform where I think a lot of this, a lot of this wacky stuff originated about 10 years ago. And I remember seeing this sticker that said, my pronouns may change from day to day, but they're still not negotiable. So, like, the idea being that, if my pronouns, why not every hour? Like, maybe you should constantly ask someone during a conversation, you have your pronouns changed. So, yeah, but it's still, if you use the wrong pronouns for someone, even if they're changing from day to day, that's apparently a terrible offense. And I think there are people proposing now that in college, or maybe even in the high school, who knows, that professors should, at the beginning of every class, do a roll call and ask everybody about their pronouns, because who knows if students' pronouns may have changed since the last class. And I think, really, I think most people do want to respect others, but I think there is a certain point at which this just becomes a kind of narcissistic exercise in really kind of making other people dance to your tune. I think some of it is kind of a power trip. Like, I can force you to use these words that you're not even sure how to pronounce, and you're going to do it because otherwise you're violating my civil rights.
Yeah, I'm lucky to memorize my students' names, much less their pronouns. So please don't give me any more to do.
Right.
Now, would you say that we're going through the same issue with race, critical race theory, and all that? That is, what is age appropriate to teach kids about the ugly history of America and how racism has been our original sin and all that stuff? Certainly seems appropriate in maybe middle school, high school, but then the conflict comes. Well, how about first grade, kindergarten? You have, Kendi's, how to raise a baby, anti-racist baby, and all that stuff.
Anti-racist baby, right.
So again, it's like, where do you draw the line? What's appropriate?
Yeah. No, I think it's, in many ways, it's a very different issue, because there is this very complicated history that's associated with it. And I think really almost everyone agrees that kids need to learn about the history of America, including its very dark side. And really, very few people deny that it exists. And I think there is this kind of sleight of hand where people say, oh, well, you don't want kids to learn critical race theory. That means you don't want them to learn about the history of slavery and racism. And, that means you can't mention Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks in school. Well, no one really believes that, I think. I will say that I think this adopting this kind of catch-all label of critical race theory was, I think, a kind of bad strategy for the people who are working against it, because then you get tied up a lot in discussing, well, is this really critical race theory? No. This is how you actually define critical race theory, and it's really only taught on the college level, and so on and so forth. And you just get caught up on a lot of nitpicking about definitions. I think that whatever you want to call it, I think there is a lot of teaching in schools that approaches anti-racism in ways that are deeply counterproductive, by encouraging kids to be constantly focused on race and introducing things, and again, to fairly young kids, like, is it okay to use certain language, like certain slang? Like, if you're white, can you use slang that's culturally appropriated from rap music? Because, that belongs to Black people. And a lot of it really is, I think, very divisive, rather than bringing people together. And I really do think, by the way, I'm not going to say, oh, we should be colorblind at all times. obviously, it depends on what you mean by colorblind. Obviously, you have to be aware of race if you want to be aware of racial injustices, which really still do exist, I think. Again, very few people would dispute that. There have been, again, debates about to what extent police shootings are, the racial disparities in police shootings are motivated by race or motivated by other factors. But I think even people like there was a study that got a lot of attention by Roland Fryer, the black economist at Harvard, showing that there isn't really, like, black suspects are not more likely than white suspects to be shot during an arrest. But even he found that, yeah, they're not more likely to be shot, but they are more likely, for instance, to be physically pushed around or thrown to the ground, even if they're not resisting any more than a white suspect. So I think, there is very little doubt that for various reasons, black males especially do get racially profiled. And I think we should all be concerned about that. I think that, as American citizens, we should want everyone to be treated fairly. And I think for to be aware of that, I think we do need to be aware of race, at various times. On the other hand, I think when you're talking to first graders, I really think maybe at that age, the only appropriate lesson is that you should treat everyone fairly and equally, regardless of their race, skin color, etc. I think the more complicated issues really should come later. So I think, there's, and I think certainly some of the teaching about white privilege that essentially makes kids feel that, if you're white, you're, you may not necessarily be a racist, but you're benefiting from white supremacy. And I've heard this argument that, that's not really telling them to feel guilty. No, I think that's really not the way things work, because if you're telling a kid especially that, you have all these unfair advantages and you're benefiting from the oppression of black people, yeah, I think that's a guilt trip. I think that, especially, again, if you're talking about kids as young as 8 or 9. So I think there's a lot of very misguided stuff, and I don't want to get into what are these people's motives? Are they on a power trip? Are they really Marxists who want to destroy capitalism? I'm perfectly willing to believe that a lot of them are very well-intentioned and really do want to encourage kids to be not anti-racist and to oppose injustice. But I think we really do need to step back and look at how we are going about some of this.
Yeah, I took one of those white privilege quizzes online the other day. Do you have white privilege? When you're driving around, do you get pulled over and harassed by the police just because of your skin color? No, and then it was a whole bunch of those things like that. But the feeling I got was that, well, this is not a privilege. This is just the way it's supposed to be. You're not supposed to get hassled because of your skin color. So it's not that I have privilege. It's that some other groups are being discriminated against. And that's the problem that needs to be stopped. Don't do the stop and frisk just because somebody has dark skin, that kind of thing. So target those people or those police departments or that particular cop right there, that guy, he's the problem. Not me. I'm not the problem. I'm just living life like the American Constitution says we're supposed to have.
Yeah, exactly.
And if it's not fairly applied across the board, then that's the problem that needs to be fixed. So it's not privilege so much.
And you are not benefiting from the fact that, other people get pulled over more often due to being black or Hispanic. It's not like, there's a quota of how many people need to be pulled over, and if a black person didn't get pulled over, then you would. At least I don't think that's the way it works. So, and I think even a number of people who fully agree with the analysis of pervasive racism in American society still say that it's really perverse, as you said, to teach people that it's a privilege not to be racially discriminated against. In a way, it really undermines the whole civil rights framework, because the framework should not be, the suggestion is almost that it's unfair that some people are treated decently and are accorded the full rights of a citizen. The problem is that some people are not being treated decently. and I think that's really putting, turning things on their head, so to speak.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I
it's
totally
like the,
agree.
the work of Chris Rufo in ferreting out all those critical race theory teaching programs and books and pamphlets and worksheets and so on being distributed amongst corporations and universities and schools and so forth, which I thought was useful. I like to know what's going on and what is being spread through culture. But then he kind of went down this other road where these are the things the government should ban. And here's a list of the books that should be banned from classrooms, should be banned. It's like, wait a minute, banning books? I thought, how did that become a conservative principle? That's not an American principle.
Right.
And so it's one thing
I think this is kind of what happens when you get kind of too deeply into the culture wars. I think it can sort of do funny things to your brain.
Yeah, for sure. And well, those are hot button issues. So, but of course, the other elephant in the room, the other Russian elephant in the room is Putin and what's going on in Ukraine. I titled this episode "The Russian Riddle Wrapped in a Ukrainian Mystery Inside an America Enigma." Paralleling Churchill's line about Russia. So you were born and raised in Russia. You came here as, I guess, a teenager, and then. So you've kind of straddled both worlds.
I left Russia when I was 16. And,
so that's long enough to have a sense of who the Russian people are. So give us a sense, just this general idea that some political scientists have, that there is kind of a culture or a type of person in a country. Like French people are this way, Germans are like this, Americans are like that, Russians are like this. Is there kind of something like a Russian character or something like that differs from Europeans?
Well, I think, again, obviously there is a great amount of diversity among Russian people. And for instance, if you look at, I grew up in Moscow among a sort of educated population. I think if you look at the population in Moscow, even if you look at the polls, and what people think, for instance, about the war, what people think about Putin, people in Moscow are much more likely to dissent from the official government line than people in small towns. And in a funny way, it really does mirror the American culture wars, except that the issues are obviously very different, where people in the small towns are much more likely to think of themselves as patriotic, except that, of course, patriotism in that context means something very different from what it means in America. They're much more likely to, believe what the government tells them, and to think that, especially during a war, you just support the government. No matter what it does. I think people in the large cities are much more likely to be pro-Western, much more likely to be pro-democracy. Really, I think there are so many different aspects to this. One of them, for instance, is that after the collapse of communism, there was for a while a very common attitude of positive feelings toward democracy and a desire to, I think this is when things began to open up in the Russian media. People began to see how people really live in the West, and I think a lot of people had the feeling that this is how we want to live. And they were really hoping, probably very unrealistically, that once communism collapsed, we're all going to live like Americans. Obviously, that is not the way it turned out, because the communist period did a tremendous amount of damage to the Russian economy, to the Russian economic potential, and the transition really could not have been easy, probably was also mismanaged. There was a huge amount of corruption. There was a huge amount of very questionable strategies where people with government connections were able to suddenly become multimillionaires by somehow acquiring huge business assets. So I think there was a kind of disillusionment in the transition to democracy and capitalism, which Russia attempted in the 2000s. And I think also because conditions were bad, and because, again, in some ways, conditions became even worse for some people, at least, than they had been during the Soviet period, when there was at least a certain amount of stability, and now everything was in chaos. And, somebody who had been an engineer, let's say, was suddenly reduced to, working as a security guard during the night shift, and, just feeling a tremendous loss of status. So I think for a lot of people, what they took refuge in, so to speak, was this dream of national glory. And the message that, look, we used to be this huge empire that was feared by the world, and now suddenly we've been drastically reduced in status, and we're being sort of kicked around by the Europeans and the Americans. I think that message had a lot of appeal. And I think that is partly what Putin exploited to build up his popularity, and to bring this message that, as he once put it, Russia is rising from her knees, and that he was going to accomplish that. And I think that is part of what happened. It's a tremendously complicated process to analyze, and I think there are so many different aspects to this. Like, one of them is, for instance, how can you even trust opinion polls in Russia right now? Because right now, supposedly, the war is very popular, but on the other hand, people are also pointing out that you don't really see people volunteering to go to Ukraine and fight on Russia's side. So is the war as popular as the polls tell us it is? Because we're seeing those pro-war, pro-Putin rallies, but then it turns out that most of the people who are there were actually told by their employer to take the day off and go to the rally. Or there were college students who were told that, if you want to get a passing grade on the exam, you'd better go to this rally and show solidarity with the government. So I think Russia right now, and obviously, and I've been writing about this for more than 20 years, the freedom of the press has been declining ever since Putin took power. One of the first things he did was muzzle the independent television networks. And it's kind of complicated because the television networks had been previously owned by billionaires who probably, didn't acquire their fortunes in very ethical ways, and who were using these networks in many cases to kind of push their own agenda. But on the other hand, there was a diversity of media in the country. And a lot of the time, there were reporters who, did their job and questioned the government and tried to get to the bottom of the real story. And all of that gradually was completely destroyed under the Putin regime. Like, at first, the large independent networks were acquired by the state, or, became these sort of public-private partnerships where they were owned by, ostensibly owned by Putin cronies, but, they were really de facto government owned, or the government owned the majority of the shares. So again, it was not entirely government owned, but, de facto. So at first, independent journalism was sort of pushed off to smaller TV stations, or to cable, and now I think they're all wiped out. Like, the last bastion, really, of independent broadcasting was a radio station called Echo Moskvy, which means Moscow Echo, which really existed from it was launched at the dawn of the changes under Gorbachev, when the independent media began to arise. And I'm not even sure how long it existed, but yeah, it was. At some point, it was acquired by Gazprom, which is the state-owned, gas giant. For a while, for years actually. I think it was acquired by Gazprom about 10 years ago, and for a long time, they basically said, yeah, we're not going to interfere with editorial freedom. See, we do have freedom of the press. And, here's this independent radio station, which is critical of the government and which is still allowed to broadcast. So it's sort of the showcase. And I think now they're really dispensing with the pretense. And in the first days of the war, or, as they call it, the special operation, they closed down this radio station. They also, it's interesting that even this language, the language of special operation, became a pretext for shutting down independent media, because one of the edicts was that you're not allowed to use the word war in discussing, the war in Ukraine. So if you use the word war, even if you were quoting someone, like, and you didn't, replace the word, and they said war, and you didn't replace it with special operation in brackets, you would get a warning from the state, media, state communications monitoring agency. And I think it was something like if you gotten the 3 warnings, they would shut you down. So, there were some publications that got shut down. There's one really, really excellent newspaper by Novaya Gazeta, the New Gazette, whose editor-in-chief was a co-winner of the Nobel Peace Prize last year, Dmitry Muratov. And they had been able to publish under very difficult circumstances. Several of their reporters were murdered, in the past 15 or 20 years. This was finally where they found themselves unable to publish. And because they knew that they were about to be shut down, I think they'd already gotten 2 warnings for using the word war. And they finally said, well, we're just going to go on hiatus because we don't want to get shut down. So, we were hoping to come back, but, for now, we're just not publishing. So it's a really, really tragic situation. And I think obviously, it's tragic first and foremost for the Ukrainians. And I really don't want to say that, anything that is happening in Russia equals the horror of these people that we're seeing being butchered in the occupied villages, of the people who are trapped in places like, in Mariupol right now, where it's just a complete, hell on earth. And it's kind of amazing to even watch this and think that here we are in the 21st century, and a lot of people have said that it feels like something out of the 1930s or 1940s. It's almost like you've suddenly time warped into a part of history that we were all hoping we wouldn't really have to see again. So there's just no question that what's happening in Ukraine is horrifying. I have read just really chilling accounts of some of the, the mass rapes in some of these places. It's just horrific. But I do think that there is also a tragedy of a different kind, and a very, very much lesser kind in many ways happening in Russia, where it really is being cut off from the outside world. The Iron Curtain is back, sort of, and I think this cultural isolation is returning, and I think it's profoundly tragic for many people who grew up, even under Putin, who grew up in a much freer society where they could travel to Europe, they could travel to Asia. Russian tourists, until very recently, you could go to Venice or Paris, and if you knew Russian, you would hear Russian speech everywhere. And it just became very, very common for middle-class Russians to travel abroad. You could watch, foreign television. You could freely watch, the BBC, CNN, whatever. And now they've lost access to all of that. And it's just become almost overnight, it went from a kind of semi-authoritarian society where, on the one hand, you didn't, I don't even want to say semi-authoritarian, because in many ways it was definitely authoritarian. There were no avenues really for independent political activism that challenged the government, or at least if you tried to engage in such activism, there was a very, very high probability that you were going to go to jail. But on the other hand, there was at least a lot of cultural freedom. And if you didn't get involved in politics, you could live a fairly free life. Today, this is really radically changed. This is no longer possible. And a lot of people are leaving. We're seeing a lot of younger Russians just, scrambling to leave before even that becomes impossible. Because right now, it's entirely possible that they will just say, well, nobody's leaving without permission from the government, the way it used to be under the Soviet regime, where going abroad was really an impossible dream.
When I ask about Russian character, I'm thinking of this guy, Alexander Dugin, who is sometimes called Putin's Whisperer.
I'm working on a piece about him right now.
Oh, good, yes. Well, because we just published a piece on that by Robert Zubrin. And he's Putin's Rasputin and so on. And he has this kind of 19th century blood and soil idea, that the Russian people are different than Europeans. They're, Euro-Asians. And he kind of draws that line around Ukraine, this side of the western side of Ukraine, right? And that's kind of their blood. That's their soil. And that those people are our people. I mean, this is such an antiquated idea, but that does seem to be baked into at least some Russian character or politics.
I think it's a very common idea. I actually, not long, like at the very end of last year, I wrote a piece for the 200th, and my brain is scrambled from all of this. In the 200th anniversary of the birth of Fyodor Dostoevsky, the great Russian writer, and it's really amazing how many of those issues that we're discussing right now were playing out during Dostoevsky's lifetime in the late 19th century. And he was someone who went from being a kind of radical revolutionary to being a very, very conservative Slavophile who believed that, yes, the Russian soul is inherently different. It's all very, very, again, very complicated and very nuanced because, yes, he believed in this distinct Russian character. At the same time, he argued, and I think a lot of these sort of Slavophiles will argue that actually the Russian character is universal. And yes, it has those Russian traits, but it's also sufficiently vast that it encompasses the best of European culture. And it's a philosophy. A lot of the Slavophile philosophy has a very fraught relationship with Europe and even with America. There's a lot of extremely, extremely complicated and nuanced cultural dynamics involving Russian views of America. I mean, there's a fascinating book to be written, I'm sure, about all of that. Dugin is an interesting guy because even by the standards of the Slavophile milieu, he is profoundly weird. He is, seriously, I mean, this is part of what I'm writing about. Like, I think he's a lot weirder than even most of the people who write about him realize. He has a lifelong interest in the occult and in mysticism with some really, really weird stuff. Like, one thing that I came across was a video from 2016 in which he says, well, it is, of course, obvious. He's talking to an audience in Moscow of, I guess, his fans. And he says, well, it's really quite obvious that we're living in the end times. And that's actually great, because if you live in the end times, that means you know how the story ends, like the story of humanity. And, and he says, think about how terrible it is if you're watching a television series and then suddenly it gets canceled before the storyline gets completed. Well, that's sort of what it's like to, live life on Earth not knowing how the story of humanity is going to turn out. But, we live in the apocalyptic end times, so we're the lucky ones. This is Dugin. So, yeah, he's very, religious. Very weird guy. In a manner of speaking, I think he considers himself Orthodox, but he also, Russian Orthodox, but he also talks about all these concepts from Hindu mysticism, I think I would say he's a charlatan, but I think he may actually believe his own spiel. He may be drinking his own Kool-Aid. So I'm not really quite sure the word charlatan applies in that sense, because I think, generally when we say charlatan, we sort of mean that they're a con artist who's just fleecing other people. But I think he may actually believe this stuff. He is, but yeah, the thing that is really interesting is that he was writing about the danger to Russia of an independent Ukraine back in 1997.
Oh, wow.
So it's fascinating that a lot of the people who are saying that, we really need to see Russia's point of view in this will say, well, it's really the fault of America for talking about possibly admitting Ukraine into NATO, and that was, I think, in 2007 that subject came up, and that made Russia feel that they were being encircled and that this was a danger to their national security. This guy is talking about the really intolerable threat that a sovereign Ukraine poses to not only Russia's security, but really Russia's sort of civilizational concept of being back in 1997, when Ukraine actually had a very pro-Russian leadership. So it's very, very interesting. And again, Dugin isn't just some random crank. He's a crank, but he's not a random crank. He is a guy who, starting in the late 90s, had very close connections to people pretty high up in the Kremlin hierarchy. Like, he was a personal advisor to a guy who was the sort of the equivalent of the Speaker of the Duma. Well, they call it chairman, but it's basically the Speaker position. So in 1999, he became the personal advisor to the equivalent of the Speaker of the House, essentially. Later, he was also a personal advisor to some other high-level politicians, and he wrote a book. The book where he is, he's written several books by now, but this 1997 book where he talks about what a danger a sovereign Ukraine is. And there's all this other stuff about the eternal conflict between, he calls it Eurasian versus Atlanticist civilizations. So basically, Russia is the kind of ultimate Eurasian civilization based on community, faith, the subordination of the individual to the state, family, authority, and so on. Collectivism, and Atlantis' civilization, which is primarily England and America and some other, adjacent European countries, is basically Enlightenment values, reason, individualism, capitalism, and all this other, bad stuff, according to Dugin. So he talks in this 1997 book about how, Eurasia, which is, Russian civilization, basically Eurasian, and locked in eternal conflict with these Atlanticist cultures. And this book was being studied by the turn of the century, was on the curriculum of military academies and a lot of elite universities. So this is a book that basically became a textbook for the Russian military and political elites. And that is a profoundly scary realization. So it isn't just Putin, it's that Putin tapped into this cultural shift that was definitely happening independent of him. And
is there no doubt that it has influenced Putin? He does have Putin's ear. He is whispering to him, this is what we need to do, and Putin seems to listen to him?
I don't know that he personally, and people actually have pointed out that maybe some of the stuff was exaggerated, because there's no indication, by the way, that Dugin actually personally knows Putin. And he has at times been very critical of Putin, because, Putin is an interesting character in that at various times in his career after he became president, there were moments when he appeared to pursue a kind of rapprochement with the West. Remember when he was very chummy with, George W. Bush, and there was that whole thing where Bush said that he looked into Clinton's eyes and saw that he had the soul of a good man, got a sense of a soul, and that was memorable. And so there were moments when I think Putin envisioned a Russia as a sort of great power in partnership with America, maybe. I think he backed away from that because he felt that Russia wasn't getting enough respect from the West, or, for various reasons. Or, I think maybe it was also partly because he wanted to build an authoritarian system at home, and I think he realized that he would not be able to do that and, remain integrated into the West. But Putin was kind of going back and forth on this, and there were moments when Dugin was very critical of him. But I think, and this is a point that I'm making in this article that I'm working on right now, as Putin turned more anti-Western, I think the daylight between Duginism and Putinism became smaller and smaller. Now, again, I don't know if there's any personal connection between Dugin and Putin. There's, again, no evidence that they ever personally met, by the way. But Dugin is connected to a lot of people who do have Putin's ear. And I think that's, it's almost irrelevant whether or not they have a personal connection.
Yeah, but now you have me worried because, I've studied end times peoples, and they're not just making predictions of the end of the world. They're looking forward to it. They would like to bring it about if they can. Because, of course, they're on the right side of history. They're the chosen people. All the other schloobs are gonna eat it, but we're gonna be, holed up in Idaho in our bunkers and with our golden gun and so on.
This guy actually says, he wants to see it happen. Like he says, we're living in the end times, and that's great. We should all feel happy about that. So I think this is a guy that we should be worried about. If he actually does, as he appears to, have connections, maybe not personally to Putin, but to people high up in the upper echelons. So he has apparently been an advisor. I don't know if he still is, but he has been an advisor to Putin's foreign intelligence chief, Narishkin, Sergei Narishkin. So that's good enough for me. I think that means he's not just somebody out there who's randomly spouting these weird theories about the end times.
Yeah, and unlike the preppers in America, they actually have weapons that could bring about the end of the world, or at least make life miserable for a great many people. Is it your sense that Putin is a rational actor in a game theoretic sense, that we could play chess with him and bargain, or do you think he could lose his mind and start to escalate things with tactical nuclear weapons in, say, eastern Ukraine if it doesn't go well, and then from there it escalates up and he finally says, "Oh fuck it, I'm just going to hit the first strike button and just see what happens."
Well, that's a cheerful thought, I think that I definitely think that he is concerned about self-preservation. I think that whether or not he is in any manner influenced by Dugin, I really cannot see him as somebody who would, go all, warm and fuzzy about living in the end times. I think he likes his villas in the West and, would probably like to regain his access to them. I think there is some indication, I think, that he is sort of drinking his own Kool-Aid, which may not be quite as extreme as Dugin's Kool-Aid, but is still pretty extreme. I think he definitely came to believe, again, I'm not sure under whose influence, but I think there are indications that he really does believe this, that Ukraine has always been part of Russia, that most Ukrainians really want to be back with Mother Russia. And he wrote an essay during the summer, as you may know, about it was titled On the National Unity of Russians and Ukrainians, or something like that. And it kind of got pretty roundly trashed by historians, but again, I think what matters to him is that it reflects his own sense of where things are. There are a lot of indications that he was very badly informed by his staff about the true state of, first of all, public opinion in Ukraine. I think he really did expect Russian troops to be greeted as liberators in many places, at least ones where there is a large Russian-speaking population. I think he was badly misinformed about the state of the Russian military and the readiness of the Russian army. I mean, we're seeing right now that he's firing a lot of people, and reportedly one of his top advisors, it was sort of this guy named Vladislav Surkov, who was sometimes called the Grey Cardinal of the Kremlin, who was, and I think he may have been one of the people who had a personal connection to Dugin. He was definitely one of the architects of this grandiose nationalist vision of rebuilding the empire. And now he's reportedly under arrest, so who knows what's going on. Supposedly, it's also been reported that there was a whole operation, and that Surkov may have been in charge of that, of cultivating a network of Russia-friendly public figures and intellectuals and media figures and others in Ukraine. And that network was supposed to be activated, once the invasion began. But apparently what happened is that the people who were supposed to be conducting this operation, like for the past 5 years, actually pocketed most of that money, and they just wrote reports about what they were doing, but they weren't actually doing any of it, and they were really just blowing smoke. So, I mean, if that's true, that's an extremely Russian story. So,
it's probably good to remember let's do a brief history of democracy in Russia. I mean, we're coming up on 250 years in 2026. So Russia had democracy, in the early 20s for like 3 years until the Bolsheviks beat the Mensheviks in the Civil War?
No.
And then what? So a little democracy at the end of...
like 10 months. I think it was
10 months,
10 months maybe. It wasn't even a full year, I think.
And then what? Yeltsin was elected.
Chaotic.
Yeltsin was elected.
In 1991.
And then Putin was sort of elected, though he was handpicked by Yeltsin. That's the extent of their democracy, right?
Yeah. And I think arguably, they still had like reasonably free elections in maybe 2003 and 2005. But I think once Putin came in, he started a very concerted effort to really clear the field of anyone who could pose a threat to him. The arrest of Mikhail Khodorkovsky, the oil tycoon who, again, whatever one may think of, the way he acquired his wealth, it may not have been completely above board and ethical by Western standards, certainly. But this is a guy who was interested in using his wealth to pursue a political career and to become a major player in politics. And this is why he was arrested, and he was accused of tax fraud, accused of all sorts of things. And again, I'm not sure to what extent some of these accusations had substance to them. There probably isn't a single business person in Russia that if you were going to be a stickler for the law that you couldn't arrest and, send away to Siberia for something. So it was very clearly a political move. Then no one really has any doubt about that. And it was really a signal to the business community that, do not try to meddle in politics. So really, not only do not try to meddle in politics by, let's say, trying to run for office, but don't, for instance, give money to political parties, which is one thing that Khodorkovsky had been doing. He had been funding independent political parties. And of course, Putin didn't want any independent political parties. He wanted a political space where there were maybe like 2 or 3 puppet parties that existed to maintain the fiction that Russia was still a democracy. I think mainly because at that point he still wanted good relations with the West. But he certainly didn't want any actual rivals. And what's also kind of amusing is that I remember in Putin's second term was running out in 2008. And at the time, the Russian Constitution, like the American Constitution, allowed the president 2 4-year terms. And there was a lot of speculation about what would happen once Putin's second term ended. And I remember attending a panel of Russia experts at the American Enterprise Institute. I think this was in 2007. And there was a Russian-American political scientist named Nikolai Zlobin, who said that he had personally had a conversation with Putin in which Putin told him, look, do you want me to sign a paper saying that I will not stay for a third term and that, I will leave office and there will be a democratic transition here. I'll gladly sign a paper. I'll gladly sign a pledge right now. And, well, of course, we know what happened. And there was a lot of speculation about how Putin would make an end run around this prohibition on a third term. There were, I think, some tentative moves in 2007 to have petitions asking him to stay on for a third term. I think he didn't want to do that because he wanted, at that time, at least theoretically, to follow the Constitution. So, of course, we all know what he did. He found this protege of his, Dmitry Medvedev, who was his handpicked successor, who ran for president, and who then proceeded immediately to appoint Putin as his prime minister. And I think it's now really clear to everyone that Putin was the de facto leader of the country during that time, and really Medvedev was just for show. I don't think anyone has any illusion that he made any actual decisions. And then, of course, in 2012, Putin came back, and by that time, the one thing that Medvedev did that was of any substance when he was in office was to amend the Constitution so that now the president could have 2 6-year terms instead of 2 4-year terms. And of course, that only kicked in when Putin came back as president. So the one thing of substance that Medvedev did was prepare the ground, so to speak, for Putin to have more time in office. So that's the way it worked out.
He comes back up for election in what, 20? If I follow that, 2026. He has to run again. 20. I'm getting confused because we have our election coming up. Yeah.
No, I think it's 2024, actually.
Also. 2024, that's right. Maybe he and Trump will be running at the same time. Well, so in terms of Putin's character, what does he want? You think, if he's really the richest guy on earth, maybe he has as much money as Elon Musk. And Elon Musk has famously said, I didn't want to just go sit on a beach somewhere. I want to change the world. I want to colonize Mars and build electric cars, and we're gonna make humanity great again, something like that. But, Putin apparently doesn't want to just go to sit on his yachts and live in these, $100 million estates. Right. He really does seem to be into the whole Russian, that Euro-Asian Russian character thing, and we're going to make Russia great again.
Yeah, well, it's hard to break down exactly what motivates him, because I actually think one other thing that motivates Putin is that he knows that if he leaves office, he is very likely going to go to jail because there are just so many reasons.
You mean by the Russian?
There is really no. Yeah. I mean, it is very likely, especially if things go badly, and they already seem to be going badly. It is very likely that his successor, whoever he is going to blame him for the collapse of the economy, for this, for alienating the West, and kind of messing up Russia's relations with the entire world, pretty much, other than North Korea and Syria, maybe. So I think part of it is actually just fear that he feels he cannot leave office safely. There really isn't a good sort of solid tradition in Russia of retired presidents, leading a happy and comfortable life,
building their presidential library.
No. And it's interesting that, Putin made a deal with Yeltsin, by the way. That was one of the reasons that he became Yeltsin's successor. Yeltsin was himself implicated in a fair amount of corruption, unfortunately. And I think his daughter was, running some business deals that were not entirely clean. So I think Yeltsin essentially made a deal with Putin that he was going to make Putin his successor, and he was not going to be bothered, essentially, in his retirement. So he wasn't exactly honored as an ex-president, but he wasn't sent to Siberia, so so far so good. But really, if you look at the way that both Yeltsin and Gorbachev have been treated, and of course Gorbachev is still alive and is routinely vilified as the guy who pissed away the Soviet Union, so to speak, and the empire. Again, I think Putin can see that there isn't really a great model for retirement. And of course, Gorbachev at least has the advantage of being somewhat respected in the West. Until fairly recently, he used to give lectures in Europe and in the US. I don't think that's going to be a great option for Putin, especially now, when he's sort of the new Hitler, basically.
I can't even see how to...
I don't think there's a good exit strategy. I don't think there's a good exit strategy if you're.
I can't even see how to go forward if, let's just play this out for a second. He takes the Donbass region and then pulls his troops out and declares victory. He said, "That's all I ever wanted in the first place. You can have the rest." And then what? Next year he shows up at the G20 meeting and shakes hands with Biden and all the other world leaders, and everybody pretends like, this is okay.
I hope not, because I think we've just especially with the modern media, we've all seen the evidence of these war crimes. And I think everyone really knows that by rights, Putin belongs on The Hague. And I think we can, a lot of people will start making arguments like, what about the US and Iraq? And I'm not going to defend everything that we did in Iraq. But I think the magnitude, if we're going to talk about human rights issues, the magnitude is really, really quite incomparable. We had incidents where American soldiers killed civilians, and those soldiers were not adequately punished. But we did, at the very least, try to prosecute those cases. And they're, by the way, very difficult to prosecute in the midst of a war. But I think at the very least, I don't think we ever said, well, we're just going to let our soldiers kill Iraqis with impunity. So I think that the comparisons are really quite insulting, and it's nowhere even near the same level of just wanton disregard for human rights. So I think that there has to be some kind of reckoning. Nobody knows exactly how, but I don't really see Putin rebuilding any kind of normal relationship with the West. And also, let's assume that they do seize Donbass. I don't think it's going to be smooth riding after that, because right now the majority of the population of Donbass really doesn't want to live under Russia. I think it's debatable to what extent, like in 2014, and this is something that I look into in my recent piece in the Bulwark, where I kind of look at the prehistory. They did those really phony referendums in Donetsk and Luhansk, where supposedly the majority of people voted for autonomy from Ukraine and being friendly with Russia. And of course, we have, as I wrote, these recorded conversations where the people who are organizing these referendums basically freely admit in conversations with each other that this is all bullshit, that they're not really even holding any kind of vote properly. And, one of them says, like, fuck, what are you going to do? Like, run around collecting papers? Just write that 99%, 89% voted for an autonomous republic. So they know that this is bullshit. So it's very difficult to say to what extent, like, even in 2014, the people in these regions of eastern Ukraine wanted to live in these pro-Russian enclaves. If you read the reports on what was happening there for these 8 years in these, Russia-sponsored enclaves, it was really a horrible human rights situation. Like, people were routinely getting kidnapped and tortured. Now, this was a war situation, and there were initially some cases that were almost equally bad on the Ukrainian side, where, in the regions bordering, Donetsk, where Ukrainian forces or these paramilitary forces would seize someone that they decided was a pro-Russian spy and, lock them up in a basement and in some cases torture them. Now, what the interesting thing that happened was that after Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch published a report on this, what happened was that Ukraine, for all its imperfections as a, burgeoning, a fledgling democracy, Ukraine actually took steps to curb this. And these things actually stopped happening. Like, I don't know if they prosecuted anyone, but Amnesty International did a follow-up several years later and said that, we issued this first report in 2016, and as far as we can tell, these practices really stopped. On the other hand, in these enclaves of Donetsk and Luhansk, these, pseudo-states, the situation really only got worse and got much more difficult to investigate. Like, they made it much more difficult for people to seek any kind of contact with human rights groups and report their mistreatment. And, there were multiple disappearances. There is a book that I think is coming out today, actually, and I forget the author's name, but it's a guy who has a personal account of being tortured, of being kidnapped and tortured by these pro-Russian forces in Donetsk in, I think, 2018. It's called Torture Camp on Paradise Street. And I've read excerpts, and it's a really harrowing book. And he basically talks about how, inside Donetsk, there was, in these past few years, this massive complex of essentially torture facilities for dissidents and other people who ran afoul of the self-appointed government. I think this is a very, very bad situation, and I think the idea that all of Donbass and a large chunk of eastern Ukraine is going to just roll over and submit to this pro-Russian regime, I don't think that's going to happen. I think we're going to see civil war there. I think we're going to see ongoing warfare. I think we're going to see, resistance and continued military action by Ukraine to liberate those regions. Unless, I don't know, maybe like the entire population will run away and, and Russia is going to be stuck with, this practically depopulated area where, I don't know. It's hard to say, but either way, I don't really see this ending in any kind of peaceful resolution.
Yeah. Zelensky
I certainly don't see this ending in reconciliation with the West.
Yeah, well, Zelensky has famously told the West, if you don't help me stop him here, he's not going to stop at Ukraine. He's going to keep going. Where else could he go? I mean, the Baltic states are part of NATO. He can't go there. What else could he do?
Right. Well, I don't know. Kazakhstan maybe, but I think a lot of those countries are now kind of seeking to get closer to the West. If you listen to the rhetoric that is happening right now on Russian television, it's completely insane. Like, they're actually talking about going to war with NATO. Like, there's a clip, I don't know if you saw it, but it was being circulated on Twitter the other day. There's a extremely popular talk show on the main television channel, hosted by a guy named Vladimir Solovyov, who used to be, by the way, he is very much a guy who changes with the times. He used to be a liberal, he used to be very pro-democracy. Now he is, for the past few years, he has been rapidly anti-Western. And this guy is talking about, well, obviously we're now at war not only with Ukraine but with NATO, because, NATO is supplying Ukraine with weapons. And, we're at the point where we're going to be grinding up NATO's war machine, and and the countries of NATO really have to think long and hard about, when this operation in Ukraine is over, where are we going to go next, and are they going to have the means to defend themselves? I'm thinking, like, are you kidding me? Like, we're all watching those broken down Russian tanks littering the Ukrainian countryside and, getting towed away by tractors. So this is like, I don't know, this looks like mass insanity. Some people have suggested to me that this is mainly for Western consumption, where they want to intimidate the West. But I mean, to successfully intimidate someone, you have to be able to make a credible threat. I mean, if I say that I'm going to go and, like, beat up Mike Tyson, that's not going to intimidate him. So,
Don't do it on an airplane, apparently.
Yeah, no. No.
Yeah.
No, but seriously, I don't really know what the game is, because right now they are at least trying to project this idea that, oh, well, you want to pick a fight with us? Well, we will, as Khrushchev once said, we will bury you.
Yeah.
But, I mean, unless that means nuclear war, and I don't think that
is what that
really
means. That is what he's talking about. That is what he's talking about.
I don't know, because Solovyov sounded like he was talking about conventional warfare, so who knows? I mean, I really don't know what is going on in their heads.
Well, if that's the case, then why not? Why shouldn't the West enforce a no-fly zone, to pick an example? And the reason appears to be because the Russians will treat that as escalation, so they'll escalate, and then you get a game theory thing where you go back and forth, and it's always the other guy's fault, and before you know it, the nuclear weapons are on the table.
Right, and of course, nobody really wants to go there, but I think that, ironically, I think the more belligerent rhetoric there is like that from the Russian side, maybe the more some Western countries at least will say, well, they're already talking about World War III, so fuck it, we're going to go in and, and of course, the whole tactical nuclear weapons scenario is also very unpredictable, because I think a lot of people, don't even really know that tactical nuclear weapons exist. I mean, they still think of nuclear weapons use as the scenario from, the movie War Games, where it's like, it's like from zero to global thermonuclear war in 60 seconds. But it's not like that. I mean, there are, as we know, nuclear weapons that could cause very, very serious devastation, not only at the moment of the strike, but in terms of environmental consequences later on. Of course, again, if Russia decided to use one of those, they would have to kind of come to terms with the fact that they're going to be a pariah state, like, forever. Are they already in a mindset where they're saying, well, them's the breaks? And that is, I mean, it's a highly dangerous situation. And I think, I think that we do have to realize that. I mean, I don't think that there's going to be, well, I was going to say I don't think there's going to be World War III, but there are people who say that we're already in World War III right now. And we're kind of like the frog and slowly heating water, where we,
I don't think so. I don't think so, but it is something we have to pay attention to. Since you mentioned the moral equivalency argument, how would you distinguish the difference between American intervention in different places around the world over the last half century, since World War II, say, and that of Russia?
Well, I think that. I obviously don't want to be, someone who says, well, if America does it, then, obviously it's good. I mean, I think that we have, for instance, done a lot of very morally iffy things in Central America, for instance, where I think a lot of the time, we intervened in ways that I think were very obviously intended to prop up regimes that protected American corporations and American business interests. So I think the history of American involvement with the coup in Chile, I think is rather morally tainted. So I am certainly not going to sit here and say that everything that America has ever done was good. I think during the Cold War, I think clearly both sides were using third world countries as proxies, essentially, for conflict between the Soviet Union and the United States. If you want to look at the Vietnam War, did America do terrible things in Vietnam? Sure. I mean, I think everyone will agree with that. Was it a war of aggression? I don't think so, because South Vietnam was under attack from North Vietnam, which was backed by the Soviet Union. So there was that. And I think if you look at the outcome of South Vietnam being defeated, and we look at the boat people, that was a really horrible situation. And I think if you look at, it was a totalitarian state that was attacking, and not a democracy maybe, but a sort of mildly authoritarian state that was not nearly as bad in terms of its human rights record. And I do think that we also do kind of have to look at it in the context of, at the time, this global conflict between the US, which was representing the free world for all of its flaws and foibles, and the Soviet Union, which represented a totalitarian menace that, really did exist to stamp out all free thought and all individual rights and so on. And I think that is a context in which we need to see it. So without defending all of America's actions, I would say that we were on the right side of the Cold War. Obviously, that doesn't mean we were 100% perfect. In terms of Iraq, I actually wrote a piece recently analyzing the parallels between Iraq and Ukraine. I think that one can say that it was a blunder to get involved in Iraq without equating it with Ukraine. Because, for one thing, we didn't go into Iraq to grab land. We didn't, grab the oil as Donald Trump suggested. I think we went in for different reasons that one can analyze and speculate. Was it to some extent, George W. Bush wanting to assert himself, and finish what his father didn't finish? And was it a sort of trauma-based reaction to 9/11? I think some people did envision at the time turning Iraq into a model democracy in the Middle East and sort of neutralizing the threat of Islamism. I don't know where anyone got the idea that Iraq could easily become a model democracy. I wrote about it at the time. I basically said, I don't really know what this is based on. It's a country with a better educated population than most countries in the region, but it's got these profound ethnic and religious differences. And it doesn't really have a history of democratic governance, so this is not very likely to work well. On the other hand, I think if the thing that is really interesting to me is that if you look at the surveys of what Iraqis themselves say, first of all, people do kind of forget that at least early on, we really were greeted by many Iraqis as liberators. So that thing that Putin thought was going to happen in Ukraine and didn't happen, it actually did sort of happen in the beginning in Iraq. We all remember those images of these jubilant crowds tearing down the statue of Saddam Hussein, who was horrible, who was, and this is, by the way, a big difference, I think, between the two situations, because, Iraq was a dictatorship that was routinely murdering its own people, that, suppressed rebellions in a horrifically bloody way, and had a murderous secret police that was routinely torturing dissidents and doing really horrific things like, torturing husbands and wives in front of each other to make them talk, so on. The thing that is really fascinating is that if you look at surveys of what Iraqis say about the war, and they did pretty quickly turn on the Americans in the sense that most of them started to say that we don't really want Americans in this country. And I think it's almost impossible, for an occupying force, especially with a different religion, with a very different culture to maintain a presence in a country and not become hated, because you're not going to be very popular as an occupying presence. And very quickly, we started to see, majorities of Iraqis saying, "We want the Americans out of here." Even so, even after the insurgency and all the terrible unrest and the religious conflict that was sparked as a result of the insurgency, we still saw, if you asked the Iraqis directly, like, was it right or wrong for Americans to go in and overthrow Saddam Hussein? I don't think there was ever a poll in which more than 30% of Iraqis said it was absolutely wrong. I mean, a lot of them said sort of it was more wrong than right. And, it always, by the way, a substantial portion of the population said it was right. Or, I think initially in the early years, more than half total said it was either completely right or mostly right. Later, it shifted toward a little more than half saying it was either completely wrong or mostly wrong, but it was very, very, it was actually quite nuanced, where most people were, a lot of people were saying, yeah, it was sort of wrong, but like not very wrong, because the upside is that we got rid of Saddam. And it all depends, of course, on how you phrase it. And if one really interesting thing is that if you ask people directly, and this was even like by the time that the Americans were leaving, when most people definitely wanted them to leave, when the question was put as, all in all, considering everything that's happened since, do you think it was worth it to get rid of Saddam? And even then, you had like 75% of the population saying yes. So I think that's really interesting. That is really interesting. I think most people don't know about that. Now, does that completely justify the war? Does that mean that, we should have gone in? I'm not going to say that. I mean, I think it's enormously complicated. And of course, there is the fact that, some 4,000 Americans died, huge numbers of Iraqis died. Some will say that our intervention created ISIS. Although it's really difficult to do counterfactuals, by the way, because none of us know what would have happened if Saddam had stayed in power. And I think that's a complicating factor. I mean, we do know, for instance, like, if we know what would have been going on in Ukraine if Russia had not started the war. It would have been like a normal state, kind of stumbling toward democracy, but life would have been fine, mostly. We don't know, we have no idea what would have happened in Iraq.
I think it's important to keep in mind the motives of the country doing the aggression. In the case of the United States, it was to end the mass bombing of German cities, was to end the war. The use of nuclear weapons was in Japan, was to end the war. And when the war ended, the killing stopped. Right. I mean, it wasn't like we just kept going. And even when MacArthur was being a little too aggressive, Truman fired him, for being too militaristic in Japan, and so forth. So that makes a big difference. We're not trying to take over a country. We're just trying to build a democracy if that's what the people want. So let's go back. We've been going an hour and 40 minutes. This is great stuff. Let's return to the American scene and give us your thoughts on what's coming. There's a lot of doom and gloom about 2024. We're heading for another civil war. We're already in a civil war because of the polarization of politics. And what if Trump gets the nomination for the Republican Party? No one trusts the outcome of the election because of all the shenanigans. He's been appointing people that will go along with rigging the election in 2024 if necessary. And are you worried about that? What would a civil war even look like in America?
Of course I'm worried. I mean, I don't think it's going to be like an armed civil war, but I think that the polarization that we're seeing is very troubling. I think we're at the point where a large percentage of the population, where there are two large groups in the population that no longer really live in the same reality or believe in the same set of facts. I think there are a lot of extremely troubling things happening on the right, associated with the rise of Donald Trump. We're seeing a lot of belief in very, very outlandish conspiracy theories. QAnon. the completely unsubstantiated, as far as I can see, stolen election narrative. Claims that I don't know, like illegal immigrants are being bussed in across the border to vote illegally, and shore up the Democrats. All sorts of other things. Claims that, and it's often difficult to differentiate between legitimate inquiry, like, about the origins of COVID-19, for instance, like, could it have been a lab leak that happened as a result of gain of function experiments? I think that's a completely legitimate point of inquiry. But then, of course, we have this theory that somehow the pandemic was engineered to create the opportunity for the great reset, and so on and so forth. So it's this globalist cabal that wanted the pandemic to happen to have a pretext to conduct the massive social engineering experiments and whatnot, or
the plandemic.
I don't know, inject people with chips and in the vaccine. It just gets more and more preposterous. So I think there's a very worrying situation there. I think where a large number of people really do seem to believe these extremely paranoid and outlandish things. I will say that while I think that the sort of right-wing propaganda machine bears a lot of responsibility for this, and by the way, yeah, they really do very often work in tandem with the Russian propaganda machine, and there is, by the way, and incidentally, Dugin was talking about this years ago, the deliberate strategy of subversion and promoting the social polarization and conflict in the West in order to undermine Western democracy. So that is a real thing, and there really are these, Russian, Russian agents on the internet who are doing all this stuff. So yeah, I mean, that is real. On the other hand, I think the mistrust in the mainstream media, I think, really is partly also the fault of the media, and part of that is because of this. The growth of this new progressivism that I think has largely displaced more traditional liberalism, where we have, for instance, this idea that, you don't report things that could, make marginalized people look bad. Or that there's this whole, idea that certain reporting or certain statements of facts may cause harm to to marginalized people, and so we've seen, I think, in terms of the coverage of social issues where you have these sort of social justice tropes implicated. I think we've seen a lot of very irresponsible behavior by the mainstream media. I mean, look at, for instance, the Jacob Blake shooting in Kenosha, Wisconsin, where it was initially reported that he was shot 7 times in the back while unarmed, while trying, that was the initial narrative, to break up a fight between 2 women. And that was a narrative that got repeated again and again, and that partly contributed to these destructive riots that caused a huge amount of damage in Kenosha. And then it turns out that apparently none of that was true. Like, first of all, this was a guy who was wanted for a sexual assault on his girlfriend, or his sort of on and off girlfriend and the mother of his children. He was, and I'm not going to say that he was, this completely evil villain. He was a guy who was struggling with substance abuse and had this troubled relationship with this woman. But at the time that the shooting happened, his on and off girlfriend called the police because he showed up in violation of her restraining order, intoxicated, and tried to drive away with I think 3 kids in the back seat of a car. So the cops who were dealing with the situation were basically trying to prevent a very erratic and possibly intoxicated guy from driving off with 3 kids in the back seat. They were not just like randomly, attacking this innocent black person. And it turns out that he had a knife. Like when they finally got footage from, because I think somebody from across the street was filming the event, and when they looked at the incident from a different angle, yeah, it turned out that there was in fact a knife that he reached for, and he was essentially shot while struggling with the cops and while reaching for a knife. And this was something that was completely left out of the early narrative, and even later, like the thing that was kind of astonishing is that even after those facts became known, you could still find reports in the mainstream media where they would give you this original and completely inaccurate version of what happened, where he was an unarmed guy who was shot 7 times in the back for trying to break up a fight between 2 women. And what's also interesting, by the way, there's a lot of talk about, Twitter needs to police misinformation. Well, did they ever police misinformation about the Jacob Blake case? No, that's not the kind of misinformation that anyone has in mind. When they're talking about, well, what should we do about misinformation on Twitter? I mean, that's misinformation. Likewise, Kyle Rittenhouse, the teenager who shot these 3 people. Again, there was some bullshit on the right where they tried to make this kid a hero. I mean, I don't think any of us should be rooting for a 17-year-old who's not very well trained in using weapons to stumble into the situation, with deciding that he's going to be a protector and fight the baddies. But I mean, I don't think anyone should have been lionizing Kyle Rittenhouse. I mean, he was. It's pretty clear he was attacked, by the way. He panicked. I don't think he really had to shoot the first guy, at least. And then, of course, the first shooting kind of led things to escalate, where he shot at 2 more people and killed one of them. I mean, I think it's correct that he was acquitted, actually, given the evidence. But I don't think anyone should have been making him a hero. But at the same time, the narrative that was given in the mainstream media, and that was repeated by some members of Congress, Alanna Pressley from Massachusetts, where they were basically saying that he was this white supremacist who drove to Kenosha from out of state with a gun. Well, no, actually, he did drive to Kenosha for his job because he lived across the state line. I mean, crossing a state line is supposed to be this thing where, oh my God, this means that you're doing something nefarious. I mean, a lot of people in my town in New Jersey work in New York and cross a state line every day when they go to work. So, it's ridiculous. And likewise, this kid was living like a 20-minute drive away, I think, from the border in Illinois. He was working as a lifeguard in Kenosha. Yeah, he drove out to Kenosha. He stayed overnight with a friend, and then the ride started. And he did have a gun, which his friend was stealing for him, so he didn't drive with a gun across state lines. But yeah, he started out doing graffiti cleanup, and then he decided to volunteer as a paramedic, and he was carrying a gun because things were not safe. Now, should he have been in that situation? Probably not. I would say, given the way things turned out, no. But again, this bad information was used to create this narrative that he was a white supremacist who was going out, hunting Black Lives Matter protesters. And by the way, because of that narrative, a lot of people actually were actually completely shocked to find out that all 3 people that he shot were white. There were literally people who were completely flabbergasted when they realized that he shot 3 white guys, because the way that this was presented in a lot of media narratives led them to think that, here's this, teenage, Hitler youth who is, going out to hunt blacks. So yeah, I think the mainstream media have a lot to answer for in terms of, undermining their own credibility. It may not be what they're doing may not be like QAnon level crazy. And I mean, this is not quite like, claiming that there's a global conspiracy of pedophiles. But I think that when you misrepresent whether it's by omission, whether it's by, actively stating facts that you kind of know to be not entirely solid. I think that's really bad, and I think it creates, it can certainly lead to, it can certainly lead to serious consequences, as in Kenosha, where the false narrative of what happened to Jacob Blake led to a huge amount of damage to the community. And
okay, Cathy, last question. Solutions to this problem. To what extent can the market find solutions? Maybe the Elon Musk of the world buy up the social media companies and straighten them out, or they generate or start up new companies that compete? Or do we need top-down government regulators to step in and write new norms and laws that are enforced? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, no, I certainly don't want top-down government regulators to step in, because, I mean, first of all, like, if you're a Democrat and you want the government to step in and regulate, you really have to stop and think that, in 2 years, it may be a government, under the Trump administration. So, that should be a sobering thought. Likewise, I think if you're a Republican who wants either states or the federal government to use its power to strong arm, let's say, private corporations like Ron DeSantis is doing with Disney right now. Again, I think you kind of have to stop and think that, maybe next time a Democratic governor will do something like this to beat up on a company that is advocating for conservative politics. So I think that is really bad, and I think we should not go down that road. In terms of, I do think I have a piece coming out actually also on the Elon Musk freakout, which I think has been really amusing. I mean, this idea that, oh my God, we're in like Weimar Germany. That's pretty crazy. But I think that, I think it would actually be kind of interesting. I don't know what Elon Musk wants to do with Twitter. I think some of the things he has suggested actually make a lot of sense. I don't get the impression that he wants to turn it into this complete free-for-all where, Nazis will be free to, make death threats to Jews and so on. And by the way, I speak as someone who actually, is a Jewish person who has received threats from neo-Nazis on Twitter. So, I know that this is a real problem. And,
or that Saturday Night Live bit last Saturday where they made fun of Musk and said, this is how badly white guys want to use the N-word on Twitter.
Oh, right. No, that's, yeah, I saw that. And I mean, that is just, I remember when Saturday Night Live actually used to be funny. I think when you become this partisan, it's just sad. I think no one really believes that. I think at least no serious person really believes that. I think there are clear problems with Twitter enforcement. The rules are. One thing that I think Musk has said that makes a lot of sense to me is that we need more transparency. Like, we have no idea right now how the rules are being enforced. Why somebody gets banned. Why a certain hashtag gets deboosted and another hashtag gets boosted. Why, some people get banned for seemingly trivial reasons and someone else doesn't get banned after making rape and death threats. I've seen this with my own eyes. Again, I don't think it's always political. I think sometimes it's really just bad moderation. But sometimes there really is pretty clearly a political bias. I think most of the people who on the staff of Twitter tend to be these social justice progressives. And it's not that they set out to be biased and to say, screw the conservatives. It's just that they quite genuinely and sincerely don't see things like berating someone for being an old white guy as harassment, where they would totally see it if it was going the other way. Yeah. So, I think that, I don't know if Musk is going to go through with buying Twitter. I would I think some of his ideas, I mean, another thing that he has proposed that I think would be very good is to rely more on temporary suspensions than on permanent bans. Because Twitter has this very sort of all or nothing policy where it's either, we're going to suspend you for 24 hours and you have to delete the offending tweet, or we're just going to ban you for life. And by the way, sometimes I think this isn't just, privileged white guys, being punished for racial abuse. I think some of this actually works against, vulnerable populations that progressive people should be sympathizing with, like, people who maybe have mental health issues, or who are on the autism spectrum, and who sometimes may have trouble understanding certain social codes and rules. I mean, I had a follower who was on the autism spectrum and who got banned for, I think, some very trivial offenses, and who was very upset because, for him, Twitter was like one of the few ways in which he got to socialize with people, because he has a lot of issues about socializing in person. So I think that there are these real solutions where instead of a permanent ban, you could, as Elon Musk put it, give somebody a timeout, like ban someone for 2 weeks and, see if that makes them rethink their conduct. So, I don't know. I mean, I think that there is definitely room for improvement. I also think that a lot of people in the media and in political activism, I think, have become a little too married to Twitter. It's like, Twitter, yeah, seriously. I'm probably one of those people. I spend way more time on Twitter than I should, and I'm not complaining. I mean, I've met some great people on Twitter. I've learned to kind of minimize the toxic aspects of it in a way that I think works for me. I think I've learned to. I mean, I think at a certain point you really have to learn to walk away from fights and realize that you don't always need to have the last word, and it's actually okay if you do not have the last word, especially if the person at the other end is a jerk, who likes picking fights. But again, I think that Twitter, because it's kind of a media playpen, I think it's assumed a rather disproportionate role in our public discourse. And I think, interestingly, some people have pointed out that this caused a lot of people in the media to underestimate the prospects of Joe Biden during the last election, because the progressives on Twitter didn't like Biden because he wasn't, really cool. He wasn't, up on all the social justice language. They didn't like him. They thought he was an old white guy. So I think that led a lot of people in the media to look at the cross section of, Twitter opinion and decide, Biden is done. And, well, we all know what happened, because it turned out that actual voters do not behave like people on Twitter. I mean, I think it's kind of useful to remember that only about 20% of the U.S. population even has a Twitter account. Those who use it, are probably a small subsection of that. And I think I also read that about 10% of the population of Twitter is responsible for, 80% of the posting. So I think when we see tweets, we should remember that we are not seeing the typical opinion. And at a certain point, I think it's gotten a little better, but there was a certain point where this journalistic genre came into being, where they would do a story that was basically about, what people on Twitter think about this or that. People are upset about, something or other. And it turns out that the people are upset means that you found 5 tweets where, people are bitching about this.
Right. The negativity bias leads us to notice the negative over the positive. Definitely. You could get 100 positive likes and 2 negative comments, and the 2 negative comments will wash out all the others, and you focus on it. So you have to kind of override that. And who's to say in 10 years or 20 years that Twitter will have this kind of influence at all? It could be there's some other platform. TikTok or something like that, or Instagram, or I don't know. There's probably a couple guys in a garage somewhere thinking of stuff to do in the next 20 years that you and I can't even think of, and that'll be the new hot thing. And we don't really need, to panic that this is something.
Or it could go back to being more decentralized, because Twitter is kind of this big aggregator where we're all kind of thrown into the same, big cauldron. And it could go back to being more kind of decentralized personal pages where people, are communities. So, well, who knows? I'm not sure Twitter is really the healthiest hub to organize our political and media life around.
Yeah. All right, Cathy, thank you so much for coming on the show. I always enjoy your writings, and I know you've got plenty on your plate now with Bulwark and Reason and Cato and all the different platforms you write for, and it's a never-ending stream of topics that pop up every week. You must get up in the morning and go, okay, what's upsetting me today? I'm going to write about that.
Right. Yeah, no, I'll tell you right now, I kind of feel like, for every 10 topics that I have in mind, I can, if I write about 2, I'm lucky because, there's really only so many hours in the day.
Yeah.
But, it's...
You can't be outraged about everything.
It's better to have too much to write about than not enough. Yeah.
Right.
Right.
All right, Cathy, thank you so much.
All right. Well, thank you very much.